Jennifer, welcome to the Coach's Journey podcast.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited as well. I've been noticing that one of the things I noticed is that sometimes because you've got a new book out, congratulations, by the way, and I'm going to talk more about that in a sec. I've interviewed people, close to the release of a book before. And what I really loved about this one is I would have loved to have read your book anyway. So sometimes it's like I'm reading the book partly, and it was this time because I finished it quicker than I would have normally because we were speaking. But I would have read your book anyway. And in fact, I first found out that it was coming out because I emailed you to invite you on, and your out of office said, "Why don't you pre-order the book?" So just to let you know, that works. I pre-ordered it that day, and it arrived on release day. So yeah, congratulations on the book.
Oh, thank you. It's amazing when an out of office works for at least one copy. That's excellent.
Yeah.
Excellent. Now I know one copy was sold in this way. Thank
Exactly,
you.
exactly. And I thought I might start with a little gratitude souk, and people who want to know about that can read the latest book, which is Unleash Your Complexity Genius. Because, and often that is in some ways, how I like to start these conversations, because often the people I'm speaking to have played a role for me in something. And we talked a tiny bit before we started about having a book out, and I was showing you your books because I think it's a cool thing. I like it when people show me my books from, albeit this time only the other side of the city, but it could have been another country. And one of the things, I do this partly because I try and notice what do I find valuable, and then try and do it for other people. And I find it valuable, but quite hard sometimes to hear the impact of my work. But I think it's still important to share it. And so there are a few things that when I was sitting with that, one is the two latest books. So these are the two that I've read, which is Unlocking Leadership Mind Traps and Your Complexity Genius that I mentioned before. And I've got Simple Habits for Complex Times. And when we scheduled this in, I thought, I haven't got time to read that before we speak. But I really appreciate the books. They're really lean. And for lean books, which makes them really readable. And so for you to know that one of the, I've already just today, given away, having just finished the latest book, I've already given one to a client, or I haven't actually given it, but I'm getting their address so I can send it to them. And I've given away Mind Traps a lot of times. So it's like, there's some ripple. And what that tells you is it was very useful for me. Both books were. They always despite being lean, I always feel like they're putting me right on the edge of what I understand. Like there's always, even when there's a topic that I might know well, there's things in it that I haven't thought about before, and new thoughts are sparked. So thank you for that. I'd forgotten this. And then as we were thinking about this, I was thinking about your work, and I remembered a time during, Mind Traps has definitely had an impact on me. The time that I remembered was, I'm pretty sure it must have been 2020, because it was a kind of exchange. It was like an exchange about in the aftermath of George Floyd's death with somebody on WhatsApp, of course, the classic place to get have important conversations about deep and nuanced topics. But I remember being in Sainsbury's, a supermarket for those who aren't in the UK, and noticing essentially that I was out of center, and thinking about your book and thinking, well, I wonder which of those things I'm trapped in right now, if any. And it was absolutely being trapped by rightness. So we'll talk more about this for listeners, but we can talk more about this as we go. But the idea that sometimes we get short-circuited basically by trying to be right. And it was a really beautiful moment. And I was able to let go of this ridiculous exchange where I was trying to prove to one of my oldest friends that I was right about something, and just let go of it. And I just felt so much better. And I don't think that was the only part of it, but I've really noticed that shift in myself from the kind of 2016 to 2018 period of desperately needing to be right and be heard about big cultural issues to just accepting things more. So thank you also for that. I was on Art of Developmental Coaching a few years ago with Coaches Rising, and that was really valuable for me. Learning about particularly the stages of development there has really affected how I think about things. And there are still questions that I learned on that program that I use with clients, and particularly your sessions were impactful there. And then last of all, I just want to tell this story. I don't think I've told anywhere else really, but this might be a really strange, I don't know if this is a strange way that you've impacted me. When I was working with our mutual friend, Joel Monk, he was my coach. He asked me this question, and people who are interested in Joel can check out the interview I did with him, early podcast episode. He asked me a great question. It's like a great coaching question for the end of an engagement, which is something like, if we were to meet again in December, and let's say it was August, like, what would you love to be telling me that happened? And from nowhere, I said that I'd written a book. And like, I never really thought about that. It had never really been my dream when I was growing up. And then he said, well, he asked me something like, what are you most curious about? And I realized I was most curious about whether this new mindset, I think I called it, that I felt like I'd been developing over this big transitional period in my life, whether it was valid in the world. And then I set out to write that book, and I didn't finish it by the December, and it's still not out. I have some books out, but not this one. And it's basically finished, but it's not out. And when I finished the last draft that was finished, which was in 2019, I think, so it's a long time. It's been sitting there for a long time. I reflected a lot on having been on the art of developmental coaching and then having read Unlocking Leadership Mind Traps, because what that work showed me really was why that mindset that I had been working on was valid, because it was essentially a more complexity fit mindset. So the echoes of what I'd been writing about and thinking about that I found in Mind Traps was really reassuring. I think sometimes if you find someone else is writing about the same stuff as you, it would be a kind of like, oh no, someone else has got there first. But actually for me, it was very reassuring as a human, I think. And for the books, it's like, well, I kind of believe now that you can have a lot of books about a good thing, and that's a good thing. But it's very reassuring for me. And then to give you an idea of the ripples of that, in spring 2020, like a lot of people, I was sitting around thinking, what the heck can I do in the face of this, madness that had been unleashed on us all, and the chaos and all that kind of thing, and knowing the strain everyone was under. I thought, how can I help? And then I thought, well, I've got like a book written about what I've discovered about how to deal better with complex situations and uncertainty. And so I released the first half of that, which is like the key ideas, for free. It's on my website. People can check it out. And I don't think that thousands of people have read that, but hundreds of people had. That part of the reason I'm thinking about it is someone emailed me just the other day, pretty much out of the blue, saying, I just read this thing that you wrote. It's really changed how I think, and I'm going to share it with the people on my group program. And the reason I'm sharing that is not because it makes me sound like I've written a good book. It's because I don't think that would have happened if it hadn't been for me coming across your work. And that's just like, so it's impacted me, but it's also rippled out. So thank you, Jennifer, for all that.
Wow, that's amazing. We can talk every day. The thing you point to, I think, is what drives a lot of us in this profession, which is the hope that something we do or say will show up in some way we couldn't have imagined, as helping somebody's life be easier, better, happier, richer, more connected, or whatever, more filled with love, whatever the thing is. But I bet there isn't anybody listening to this conversation who doesn't have that as one of the driving impulses of why they get up in the morning. So thank you. That's why I get up in the morning. It's beautiful to hear that that for at least this one person, there are these various ripples that I could never have imagined, but that live.
Yeah, and I guess it's apt for someone whose work is a lot about complexity, that it's like we can't predict where the impact will happen, and sometimes that's the most beautiful part of it. And the last piece of, I guess, gratitude, it's like that kind of wince, is thinking about that book that I wrote that's written and not out. People who know my work well know that the books that have come out of mine are really about that. They're about what are these pieces of work that we want to do, that we want to do, that aren't in the world, and how do we get them into the world. And so the good thing about having written that book is I've written it for myself, really. And now I know, now that I've named that book again and named the other book, the new book, The Power to Choose, its provisional title, I kind of know that I'll have to, and I've talked about it here again, brought it back to life, I'll probably have to put it out. So that'll be partly to do with you as well, Jennifer. I wonder, I suspect this will take us to somewhere in the middle of your journey. A question that I often ask of guests is, where did you first come across coaching in the way that we talk about it and mean it now?
I mean, it's funny. It goes pretty much to the beginning of my journey because my mom was an executive coach.
Was she? No one on the show has
Um,
ever answered that question with that answer. Yeah, it's a bit surprising to me
Crazy,
in
right?
some ways, but I guess she must have been an early adopter.
Crazy. She was right at the beginning,
Yeah.
right at the beginning. Um, and in 2000, no, in 1998 or something like that, like, this is a long time ago, she was working on a book on coaching. And she asked me to co-edit this book with her, which came out in like 2001. And I was a doctoral student at the time. My mom, her name is Catherine Fitzgerald. Catherine is and still is one of the smartest, most interesting people I've ever met. Um, and we had sometimes we would have gatherings, parties, or whatever, and all these clients would come to these gatherings. They were social gatherings, her birthday, or whatever it might be. And they would share stories with me about what it was like, and how she had changed their life. And I was like, this is a thing, you know? And over the course of editing this book, which is called Executive Coaching Practices and Perspectives, something like that. But it was like a book called Executive Coaching. And at the time, that was a differentiating title. Because, right? And so it was some years before I started doing coaching myself. But the idea of coaching was in me, like from a relatively early moment in the history of coaching, and the capacity of coaching to make a dramatic difference, not just in the life of the person we're talking to, but in the lives of those that these people are somehow responsible for. The people they lead, and the people that those people lead, and the people that those people lead. As you coach senior leaders, the ripples are big.
Yeah. Wow. And what a thing to to have those parties where someone says, and I can imagine why you would do it, right? Because I kind of got a feel for this. So my mum was a counselor for the last couple of decades of her career. My dad had some time as a psychotherapist as well, but those are a bit different. So it's like we didn't meet the clients in that way for
Right, those are quiet.
reasons.
Right,
Yeah.
those are kind of more private.
Yeah, and so, but I have got this feeling. I wonder if I don't know what it is. Like, I got this feeling of somebody telling me of the impact of one of my parents, but I don't remember what it is. I'll have to ask them. So I can kind of imagine, and I can kind of imagine why you would want to do that. Like, if I met the children of a coach I was working with, and it was really changing my life while I was doing it, I would kind of want them to know. But what a beautiful thing, I guess. Unless it was a bit weird, it might have been a bit weird for you to get to hear those stories.
It was fabulous. It was amazing. It was amazing. My father was an English professor, and I went to his retirement party and heard stories from, these former teachers, these former students of his, some of them were now teachers. And, and I grew up, I became an English teacher, and then I became, and I followed dad's footsteps, and then I jumped over and became a coach and a leadership expert and followed mom's footsteps. So, yeah, there's something about my parents' journey that has been incredibly important in my life.
Yeah. And so at first it was teaching. That was that was the first career, was it?
Yeah. I taught middle school, so like 11, 12, 13-year-olds. And then later I taught older kids, 17, 18-year-olds, and then I taught a little bit of college and university, and then a little bit of graduate school. I sort of just worked my way up the age ladder until I was working with leaders and organizations.
And so that the shift from, or maybe it was just maybe they were all small shifts, but the shift from following in your dad's footsteps to following in your mum's footsteps, how did that come about?
Yeah, of course you really understand shifts later, not in the moment. I was a teacher, and I started to do professional development of teachers, teaching teachers. I felt like I didn't really know enough about that. I went back to get my doctorate, and I thought I'd be a college professor who taught teachers. And I did that for a while. I was a college professor who taught teachers.
Is this
The
what you were
doctorate was
studying while you were editing your mum's book?
It was, in fact. The doctorate was in adult development, which is why it made sense for me to edit this book, because even though I wasn't doing coaching, I was studying how it is adults grow and change. This became the thing that would animate basically my whole career, is this question about how do we adults grow and change, particularly to be better able to handle complexity. And I was doing that in graduate school, and then doing that teaching graduate school, teaching teachers and principals. And then I had a kind of a side hustle, which was in the leadership space. And that side hustle, and then we moved to New Zealand, and life takes you places. And that idea of doing transformational work to support teachers and principals in schools turned into the idea to do transformational work to support leaders in organizations. And so it was more of a gentle transition than it never felt like, oh, I'm making a career change. It never had that feel. I felt like, oh, I'm moving to New Zealand. It had that feel, but then it was much more emergent.
Yeah. And there's a story in the latest book about reading one of Robert Keegan's books, and how that was like the thing that took the implication of the story. That was the thing that took you to adult development. I wonder if you could just give us a sense of that story, and particularly the insight that was in that book that really caught you. And then I guess for people, I don't know if this is possible, you must have been asked this a million times. I could try and do it and see if I can remember what you taught me on Coaches Rising. For people who don't know what adult development is, maybe after you've given us that sense of what took you there and what so excited you about Keegan's work, you could give us just a top level of that idea.
So, I went into graduate school. I was like 25, 26, something like that. I'd been a teacher for a few years. I started young. So I'd been a teacher for several years, and I went back to get my doctorate. And early on in that first year, I don't know if this is a story you want, but anyway, this is a story you're going to get. Early on in that first year, I was pregnant with our first child. And the shift from being a teacher to being a doctoral student, and then from being like a woman to being a mom, was these shifts were cataclysmic, right? Like they were so huge, and I could just feel my identity was like held together with Scotch tape, right? Like I was just barely making sense of me. And at the same time, I was reading this book called In Over Our Heads by Bob Keegan, and taking his class, and watching me become disorganized in the like my identity becoming disorganized in the path towards becoming reorganized in a different way, and studying the way we grow and change over time. It was breathtaking for me because I wasn't just learning it, I was absolutely being it. Like it was very alive for me. And particularly alive for me was this sense of the shift from, and this gets into the theory a little bit, the sense of the shift from the socialized form of mind, which is where we're kind of breathing in the expectations and the hopes and the norms of the society we've come to affiliate with, and moving towards the self-authored form of mind, which is as we begin to write our own story, as we begin to not take in those views, perspectives, expectations, but begin to write something of our own views, values, expectations of ourselves. And like reading about that theoretically and knowing that I absolutely could not do that. Absolutely. like like as it was, as Bob would be describing it, I'd be like, oh, I see how that's theoretically possible. I see how that's theoretically possible. And then you get to one place where he was describing something, I'd be like, no way. Like that's not even theoretically possible. Like this guy's a Looney Tune. And so having that idea that I wasn't just like falling apart, that I was falling into something else, and that something else was going to be qualitatively different and still in some ways qualitatively the same as I had been, was just like the most helpful idea I'd ever heard. And so I guess that's part one. And part two of the same story is, as I was doing research in this, I was lucky enough to be one of 3 doctoral students who got to work very closely on this big research project Bob was leading, um, and do a billion interviews, these things called subject-object interviews, which are the measure of development. These interviews are hard to learn to do. They're like very exacting. Learning to do them is one of the hardest things I've ever done. And teaching other people how to do them has been one of the greatest joys of my life. Mm-hmm. And as I would do these interviews, I would realize that the thing that I was trying to do is see a whole human and see how that human in front of me made sense of the world. And that actually understanding the way another person makes sense of the world, in this case, using adult development as kind of a frame, but understanding that as hard as I could, like really as hard as I could. It was one of the most glorious endeavors imaginable. It was really seeing another person brings love between you, right? Like that is what love is. It's to really see without fixing or changing or correcting, but really, really seeing and admiring another human being in their fullness. That changed my life.
Yeah, it's beautiful. And I guess I haven't done those interviews, but I have a feel of it, of when you can really see something through someone's eyes, for want of a better phrase, with the way they see things. It's a really wonderful experience. And I think it's like it probably couldn't, it would probably be impossible for us to say too many times, emphasize the thing you said, right, which is that you weren't falling apart, that you were going from, what did you say, organized to disorganized, but on the path to being organized again in a different way. Because that feeling of I once had this idea that it's like, I'd never done trapeze, right? But I imagine that there's this point if you're jumping from one to the other, it's like even when
You got,
even when you
yeah,
know, right? Even when you've read the book, like you say, or you've heard somebody teaching it, you kind of know you're going to get organized again.
mhm,
The trapeze artist probably knows they're going to catch the trapeze, but that does,
mhm.
I mean, for me at least, in my all the little ways I've changed and developed it, that period of disorganizedness between the trapezes, it is quite a thing.
It's necessarily terrifying, right? It's necessarily terrifying as those things that we've relied on to make sense of our lives fall away. And the new things that we will rely on to make sense of our lives have not yet been born. Um, it is I often think that developmental theories were mostly crafted by men, right? This is where they mostly come from. But I often think that if they had been more crafted by women, we would get many more labor analogies,
Yeah.
because there is this like between being pregnant and holding a child in your arms,
Yeah.
there is there's difficulty, right? And that difficulty for many, many years was actually very dangerous. And now it's mostly not dangerous at all, but it still feels dangerous uh, as you are in the process of birthing something into the world, and you have no idea what that thing is.
Mm.
You know it's human, but that's pretty much all you got.
Yeah.
You might know if it's a boy or a girl. You don't know who that person is, and so um, there is this longer gestation and birthing period, but because we we don't have a lot of stories about it, and we don't have the physical evidence of a new life. Um, it just feels terrifying. As you could imagine, if you were pregnant and not knowing what that was or what was happening, and then you went into labor and you didn't know what that was, and you had no idea what any of this thing was, that whole experience would be just beyond terrifying. And I think a lot of us experience our own growth that way.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right. It's a beautiful metaphor for perfect metaphor, or feels perfect for all that kind of thing. It's probably worth saying, you kind of referenced a couple of them in the, I think in Bob Keegan's model, right? That's the levels that you're talking about. That it's worth saying for people that we can't do justice to that incredible field of work in the space of, even if we spent the rest of this conversation talking about it. But is this right, that basically this is what I remember from that course, from other things I've read and heard, we're going to go through the ideas of adult development theory really are that there are a series of particular, or it can be approximated to a series of stages that each of us might go through as the world asks more of us, or we're faced with different challenges. Maybe you might want to say something to correct that language, but just that there are a series of kind of patterns amongst humans that seem to be there, including those two levels that you just referenced, which I think I've heard you or somebody else say there, that are kind of like, this is the shift that often is happening when people are, I guess, coming to coaching or
Mm,
wrestling with one of these transitions in their adult
mm,
life. The most common one that we'll be
that's
seeing is
true.
from the socialized mind, is the name given to it, which is this thing you mentioned about all the hopes and ideas about how to be, I guess, a good person in different ways in a society, to a place where you define that much more in the self-authored mind. Please correct anything in there that needs correcting.
Ideal. You've done super well.
Like, as you've touched on gender there, like, I'm aware when I've thought about the socialized mind, maybe it's because of the age I am, because I'm late 30s and we've just had a baby, and so I can see nearly 2 years ago, but I've been able to see exactly the extra layers that at that stage in a professional woman's life it gives to the kind of things that you're talking about. Like, we're living that now, and it's very, very hard. I can see what it is asking of my wife Emma, um, and I feel like in my coaching, I've, again, perhaps because of the age I am, and therefore some prediction of the age of clients. Is there anything like, what is there? Feels like there's something around those two stages and the differences for men and women. Is there anything you're able to say about that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to say about gender, and a lot of people have studied this and know way more about it than I do. Um, but there are a series of societal expectations um, programmed by our Western society for hundreds of years that encourage a set of ideas or behaviors about what success looks like for men and what success looks like for women. And then there's biology. There's a set of biological pulls and capacities, many of them having to do with things like child bearing and rearing, that also make a set of demands on us. So we have like both the outside demands, and then we have these inside demands of our own bodies, our own biology, and the way women have needed to care for young, become attached in new ways, become affiliative in different ways, because that was how to maintain the next generation. This is how we've evolved. And there are some theorists who really would dispute the thing that I just said. So I just want to acknowledge that this is, you read one line of theorist and you get this, and you read a different one and you get that this is all crap, the thing that I just said. But I think that those two things together, the kind of internal embodied relationship to the creation of new life, and the capacity to create new life, and the external pressures of society, which has been in many ways ridiculous for women, just absurd. This idea that you can have all of these things just leaves most women who are trying to have like this rich family life and also this rich career life, like on their knees, and feeling incredibly overcome by their inadequacies, what feels like their inadequacies. Yeah, I think it shifts the developmental story. I think it shifts what demands are made upon us and how we deal with them. And sometimes I think it's actually pretty advantageous, right? When you come to a limit, something has to give. And often what gives is the former way we were organized. We become disorganized and we reorganize. That's pretty advantageous to have something that brings you to that and helps you reorganize and you grow.
Yeah, forces it really. Like, and I've seen this quite often with friends, family, clients, those late 20s, early 30s, the biology really starts to kind of kick in, the sense of mortality kicks in. And if you can't, like you say, you're kind of forced to make a shift that I think, men can probably, speech marks, get away with not making.
That's right.
Very hard to do that if, like you say, if there's these, I think it probably was something you said on developmental coaching or something, that helped me see that in a new way. It is this impossible mesh of, to be a good mother, this has to happen. To be a good professional, this has to happen. And to be a good woman in the 21st century, you have to do everything.
That's right.
And it's like, that is a mean set of circumstances.
Yeah, that's right. I find my clients, I often think of them as dealing out a deck of like identity cards, and they compare themselves. I compare myself on the mother identity card to the best mother I know, and I compare myself in the work identity card to the best worker I know, and I compare myself in the scientist identity card to the best researcher I know. And so you have all these cards that are all pieces of our identity, and you choose some exemplar from each piece who has generally nothing else but that piece, right? Like the best researcher doesn't have a family, doesn't do other things, just researches all the time. The best, the best of each of these things tends to be like very uni focused. And you say, would you want that whole person's life, that person's whole life? And they say, absolutely not, like absolutely not. But you're going to make yourself feel bad. You're going to hit yourself with that stick because you don't, in that category, you don't shine in the way that that person shines. It's like very much sets us up to feel awful about ourselves.
Yeah. I hope that a lot of people are listening to that thinking, oh, this is me, and getting that beautiful insight, which can allow us to make choices. I think that's that the subject object move basically happening there.
That's right.
It's like
yeah, that's right.
Yes, I think let's do a couple of more building blocks before we come back to your story. So maybe now that I've mentioned that one, I'll do that, and then you can tell me where I've got it wrong, and then I'll ask you a question. You can answer it. So one of the most interesting, this is one of the things that resonated with what I was trying to write about in that draft book. It's like when we can see what's happening to us or what's happening in our life, we're no longer subject to it. It's no longer happening to us. It becomes an object we can see. And so for people listening, this is a lot of what people are doing in their coaching. It's helping their clients see something, slow down enough in the conversation by asking great questions and reflecting things back to see something they hadn't seen before, which gives them this little bit more choice and perspective. So correct that. And then maybe, I think the other thing we probably need before we, especially to get into the books a little bit more, is maybe the relationship between adult development and complexity, and say something about the complicated distinction, which actually, to interrupt you already, which I once tried to do on this podcast, got slightly wrong. And I'll talk about that in a sec if it feels relevant. Didn't get slightly wrong, but had a slightly strange exchange because I was trying to do it when I hadn't thought it through properly. But so is there something you can say just to give people the building blocks enough about developmental psychology and complexity so that we can then jump off into other places?
Sure. Your description of subject object was beautiful. So
that's definitely a relief. I was probably doing the thing right where I'm comparing my understanding of developmental psychology to you. It's fine, Robbie. I can chill out.
Yeah, we do that. It's probably helpful in many ways, and as long as we don't use it as a stick to beat ourselves with, probably cool. Yeah, this question about complicated versus complex. This is a distinction made famous by a complexity theorist named Dave Snowden, who's a Welshman, still writing and thinking about complexity in super interesting and confronting ways. His website is called Cognitive Edge. I think it's cognitive/edge.com, but if you Google Cognitive Edge, you'll get it.
Yeah, we'll put links to everything. People are listening, we'll put links in the show notes for stuff like that. Yeah, perfect.
Awesome. And Snowden makes the distinction between different kinds of systems, right? There are systems that are predictable and they repeat. And you can expect that something that's happened before will happen again. You can expect that a problem you solved before, you could solve it again in much the same way. And he breaks that down into two different kinds of problems, some of which are obvious, he calls them, and some of which are complicated. And this idea of complicated problems are those that you need some experience or expertise. They're tricky. And so, like my accountant can figure out my taxes every year, but I can't. So they're figure outable, right? But I can't do it. An engineer can create the new iPhone, right? Like that just came out today. But I can't do that, right? Like it takes expertise. But those engineers can create phones, right? Like those accountants, they can do taxes. They can do my taxes. They can do your taxes. They can do anybody's taxes. And these engineers, they make stuff. They can do that, and they can do it pretty reliably in different contexts. That's complicated. And then there's another set of things that comes from a totally different kind of system, a complex adaptive system, which are so intricate and so interdependent that you cannot know what's going to happen next, right? Child rearing is the classic here, right? Like how many things go into a child's life? You have a 2-year-old, right? How many things go into how that 2-year-old is going to grow up and be a grown-up, right? You cannot know. And we can approximate that and often in kind of ludicrous ways of if my kid gets into the right kindergarten, then they'll get into the right elementary school, then they'll get into the right college, then they'll get into the right university, then they'll get into, and then they'll have a successful life. But this is false, right? This is a story we make up about things that are predictable, and it's our grasping for that. And it turns out that our embodied system is, the more we know about neuroscience, the more we understand our biology, the more we understand that our psychology and our neurology is like incredibly predictive. We're constantly, our emotions are predictive, our reactions are predictive, our thoughts are, we're always picking up the past and putting us in front of us as the future. And if we do that and we are subject to it, then we believe these stories. And over time, we can grow to have more and more of that like natural shaping become an object for our reflection, so we have choices about it, so that we can notice, oh, I'm living in that's a really simple story about the way kids grow. And we can notice that we're living in that kind of simple story, and then we can choose another story that's roomier. And this is the connection between this inner thing about how do we grow, how do we see more of ourselves, and how do we see kind of more of the operating system by which we live. Because these old automatic operating systems require that somebody in charge is like handling things for us, right? That if we're not authoring it, somebody's authoring it, right? And in this world, less and less, we can point to, oh yeah, I'd really trust that. I'd really trust my organization to author my life. I really trust them because like I've worked for them for 30 years and I'm going to work for them for the rest of my life. I really trust them. I really trust my minister to author my life. I really trust my mayor to author my life. Like this is kind of a cringy thing. Like you hear this list and you think, no, that's dangerous.
And
not a good idea.
Do you think that, like, did it used to be a better idea?
I think it used to be a better idea.
Yeah, to trust those
I think it
kinds
used to
of
be a
people
better
or
idea.
the organization.
I mean, trust your rabbi, right? Like we had village elders, right? And those village elders were often wise, and the world was simple enough. I mean, there was all kinds of room for misery in this thing, like, but the rules of the road, you read Jane Austen, there are rules. You know what they are. Everybody knows what they are. We all agree. You have to follow those rules or you get in big trouble, right? What are the rules now? We don't know. And they'll be different tomorrow. And so how do we make sense of that? We need much more sophisticated operating system in us to be able to make sense of all those changes and make up our minds and live. I think it used to be, it maybe wasn't easier to be happier, but it was easier to know whether you were coloring inside the lines or not.
Yeah. And I think just to tie that up, and then I want to ask a question about that. It's that, right? That the needing more and more perspective is these developmental shifts. It's like it's like the world being more complex, requiring all these more of us to be able to make the decisions to live that kind of.
Yeah, and we knew that was true. Piaget told us this is true for kids, right? That we had these like particular sets of heuristics or whatever to make sense of the world, and we would be able to stretch into those for only so long, and at some point they would break. And when they broke, this thing called growth would happen. And then we would, like become unorganized and reorganized. And then we would hold on to that for as long as we could. And then something about the world around us would be like, no, you cannot have that rule about the world and still make sense of the world that you're in. And then that thing would break. And then we'd have the next one. And this is what's happening to us, right? Like, you can't have that view of the world. You can't hold that assumption and have the world make sense.
Mm.
Wow, like now I need a new career, or I need to reinvent myself, or like something breaks apart, and then we use those pieces and construct a new thing.
Yeah, I think it's just like a really interesting. I love that. I love that thing. Like, there's a thing that, and I hear this from clients. I hear this from clients. It's like, it's the kind of this kind of, sometimes it's an audible groan, which means, I can't unsee that thing that I've just seen.
That's right.
The thing is just broken. It's a bit like I said about talking about the book. I just kind of that draft book. It's like, I just caught this thing. It's like, oh yeah, I'm doing that thing that I do, and now I have to do something with it. How annoying. But the right, good, but annoying.
Exactly right, but annoying.
Yeah. So what's interesting for me is in this, let me see if I can capture this idea and thought. So I had a load of these things break about 10 years ago, particularly around kind of how terrible the world was. Right? I had this story, we could say, simple story, that the world was terrible, it was getting worse. And then by accident, I came across all these other people telling a story about how actually in these ways, the world is like better than ever before. And it's not that they're not right, that for example, that fewer women die in childbirth now per childbirth than ever before, almost none in a country like this. And, everyone in a country like the UK knows somebody probably who's been through a childbirth that would have resulted in them dying if they were alive 500 years ago or something like that. And I used to think that all the kind of the world's so complex thing was a part of that same simple story that the world is bad. That like everything's terrible. We live in this awful place. Of course, there are bad things happening. Like I guess I want to catch that is those two are both too simple. The stories, right? I need to say that before anyone thinks that I'm saying there's nothing bad happening in the world. So I had that thought, and that's one of I think it probably came from, again, Art of Developmental Coaching, reading Mind Traps around that time. Listening to you, it's like, oh yeah, actually, the world is more complex, was what I got to. But then I have there's people who are supporters of the podcast or members of the community we have can ask questions, and one of them asked a great question, which I want to kind of give to you now, which is essentially a coaching question about complexity. And if we see the world as complex, if we assume the world is complex, we see it as complex. And if we assume, because often we see what we assume. And what are the question, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to remember, but if instead of, I guess something like this, if instead of seeing the world as more and more complex, we chose to see the world as more and more simple, like, what do you think would happen? And yeah, what comes up for you as I ask that / share a long paragraph of thoughts?
I think we have to unpack what it means to see the world as complex or see the world as simple.
Yeah.
Complexity got really popular as a word. Oh, complexity is really popular. I remember when my first book was coming out, my editor was like, there has to be complexity in the title of this book somehow. And by the time Mind Traps came out, they were like, I'm not sure we can have complexity in the title of this book, because it's I think it is in the title. I actually don't remember.
It is Unlocking Leadership Mind Traps, How to Thrive in Complexity. It's
there you go. There you go. I think it's turned out to be in the title of all of my 4 books. And then there's I once spoke at a leadership conference, and they were going to put me right after this person who wrote a book called The Art of Simplicity, or Simplicity Rocks, or Simplicity is Great and Complexity Sucks, or whatever it is, whatever that thing was. And they were like, oh, you two would probably hate each other. And I was like, I really doubt this. right? Because almost always when people are talking about simplicity, almost always what they mean is the rich simplicity of essence, right? They don't mean simplisticness, right? Nobody's like, oh, let's grab onto fallacies. They're like really easy to understand and let's propagate them. I mean, this is the way many political parties work, let's be clear. But by and large, what people who are craving something simpler are looking for is, can we get rid of the what I think of as the complicatedness, the way we goop up things by bureaucracy and 10,000 processes and all these ways that attempt to keep us safe from the overwhelm of our mortality, or the overwhelm of how vulnerable we are to having our hearts broken, or the terror that somebody we love could get sick and there's nothing we can do about it. And so we like cushion ourselves from those ideas with money and cars and stuff. And we cushion ourselves in organizations with rules and bureaucracy and like forms to fill out. And so I'm a huge believer in simple, but it's the simplicity on the far side of complexity. You know, the simplicity that is the connection to essence, as opposed to the simplistic nature of, I think I understand it all and I think I can control it all. I think that idea, this like, I can understand it all, I can get it right, I can control it, I can know what's going to happen, I can make stuff happen in that way. I think the more of that we get, and plenty of people believe in this world too. First of all, they're exhausted because they're wrong all the time. And then they think, oh, I have to work much harder I was wrong this time. That means I screwed up, or my people screwed up, or we need another rule, or whatever. We have to work much harder so that this thing doesn't happen again. And so they're constantly overwhelmed. And they make life bad for other people. Like we can't ever have that kind of thing happen again. So it's life. It's life. And so I think that there is, I think that there are dangers. Our firm, we've changed the way we express our purpose right now. But in 2016, we came up with a purpose statement that was about helping people get beyond simplistic expressions and beliefs about the world, and the dangers, which we were seeing in 2016 was a year of a lot of dangers, and a lot of simplistic responses to those dangers. I think simplistic responses are scary. Understandable, kind of just warm and delicious when you have one. But it's like having chocolate pudding for every meal. It will not create a healthy life.
Yeah, and I think one of the ideas from unlocking leadership mind traps that stayed with me the most is, I think, I can't remember exactly the phrasing you use, but it's rather than control, enable, or creating the conditions instead. It's like there's a simplicity in that. Like there's a real relief actually in knowing that you can't control the thing. And this actually gets to, I'm aware that in bringing this back up, am I being trapped by being right? But I actually had the conversation I mentioned before. I had a great conversation with a woman called Kathy Presland on the podcast, and we talked a bit about complicated, complex, and we had this exchange, which was, I used child rearing as an example, and she said, well, actually, I think that's really simple. It's just love. And it's like, there's the like, that's the other side of complexity, right? It's like, yeah, if you just really love the little being, then that's a pretty good chance that you're enabling that being to have a good life. And it's, I got to say, like, if I think about that, it's a massive relief that I, for some reason, had that sense through the things I've learned, the things I've read, who I am, where I came from, all those things. Because, you know, there's an, I mean, the economy around new parents and the conflicting, you must do exactly this stuff that you encounter is a minefield. And back to that socialized mind piece, how to be a good parent. Well, you can have 1,000 people. You can have where you could have that same thing with the cards, but you're dealing out over here to attachment parenting, over here to super nannies, over here to something else, over here to how they're sleeping and all these things. And yeah, always comparing how you're doing to the child who sleeps the best, who walks the fastest, all that kind of thing. Yeah, so it's like it's a massive relief. There is a simplicity and a massive relief to letting go in those times. And of course, I say this as someone who has that relief some of the time, and some of the time absolutely does not have that relief personally.
Yeah, I was working with a set of accountants, bankers, years ago, and at the end of whatever, we had a day together, and at the end, one of them said, "I never understood the redemptive power of complexity."
Huh.
And I was like, that's amazing. How are we redeemed by this idea that yes, there are things that organize us? You can love your child like crazy and also screw them up massively, right? Like you can love your child like crazy and have bad things happen. And so, yeah, it's an enabling condition. It's absolutely the ground of parenting, and it guarantees you nothing. There,
Yeah.
mortality guarantees you nothing except death, right? The only guarantee is the thing we don't want. It's the only one. It's the only one. And so I think when you notice that the only thing that's guaranteed is the thing that we don't want, and everything else is up for grabs, yeah, you can either be freaked out by that, or you can begin to find the redemptive power of that to breathe a little bit more easily, um, to craft the conditions of your imperfect life in ways that bring create the conditions for more of what matters most to you.
Yeah, and I love what that person said. And for some reason, the word redemptive, what it made me think is, actually, when we're trying to control everything, it's kind of like a God complex. It's kind of like we
Yeah,
believe we're a God who can predict exactly how this, in my case, little girl will turn out and how she'll have the best time, and I will be, God for her, but I will also be it for my clients and my wife and when I worked in organizations, my organization, because it's the hero, right? Hero complex. I can do anything, and it is, that language is powerful to release that. It's like, no, I'm just. We talked a bit before we switched on about how perfectionism has been, or releasing perfectionism has been a big part of my journey. It's like, I am an imperfect human, and therefore I'll just do what I can, and that's it. And I can't control how life turns out for this little girl, but I can do some things.
that's right. That's right. It makes us. It actually lets us be in our legitimate power instead of like the illegitimate power of a God complex. It lets us understand how are we legitimately powerful. Father is like one of the most powerful things in the life of a person, and that's super legitimate. Can you make things happen? No, but you shape the conditions of her early life, and thus the conditions of like all her relationships into the future.
Yeah, and you got to be careful, because it's like responsibility of that can
That's
weigh
right.
heavy, and
That's right.
a bit like knowing that the only certainty is death. Like, I'd much rather know that I have that responsibility than accidentally realize, know that I'm going to die, than accidentally realize in another 30, 40 years, and then be
Yeah.
like, oh shit, I should have done
Yeah.
those other things. I'd rather know now
That's right.
that's happening, hard as that feels when
Yes,
it's the middle of the
and
night
it's
and
heavy.
wondering about what's
Yeah.
going on. Gonna just jump straight in with this one, because I think we're like right on the edge of it, and we haven't kind of like, maybe it's the perfectionist in me wants to go back and complete some bits from earlier, right? But I finished reading unleash your complexity genius today. And of course, the last part of that is about what we're talking about now. It's about love. Mm. And in there, there's this absolutely beautiful bit about polished and unpolished vulnerability, and the importance of it in creating connection and creating essentially love in organizations. I wonder if, you could speak to that a little bit. And I wonder if this is quite a big question, so feel free to bat this one away. I wonder if there is some unpolished vulnerability that you'd be willing to share. And I can have a go at that as well.
Yeah, there's this, one of the things that's been cool about being in this profession for a while is that you see trends come, right? And there's like a vulnerability trend, thanks to Brene Brown and others. And she's a genius. And because of her, leaders understand, and because of the work of Amy Edmondson, which I also super admire, leaders understand that they have to bring something of their humanity to work. And I started to notice, I spend time in leadership conferences, I watch senior, like the meeting of the top 300 leaders and the chief executive or whatever, the CHRO or the chief financial officer, whatever, right? Like somebody with a C in the title, right? Like they'll stand up and they'll have a story, and that story will make people in the audience like feel moved, and they'll maybe even cry, and maybe even the person on stage like tears up a little bit. And then you go to the next one of these conferences, and that person stands up on the stage and they give the same speech, and the audience is moved, and like maybe that person cries, and it's like, oh, you're actually telling us something about yourself that you want us to know, and you're telling it in this moving way, but actually you're still the hero of the story, right? You're still offering to us something that makes you shine, like, oh, my grandparents were poor farmers, and they've instilled these values in me, and this is what my grandpa said to me, or whatever, my father died when I was young, and this is what happened. But all of it is to show like, oh, you're a great guy. And it wasn't until we started to have leaders like say things that they're really not sure how it's going to go. We ask leaders to imagine there are these sliders, and this is for intimate conversations, right? This is for like when I'm with my top team, but a slider between polished and raw, and a slider between like heroic and I'm not sure how I stand there, and to dial as close to the unfamiliar side as you can, and this is a hard thing to ask, because our minds and our bodies really reject this, and often it takes our living through real hardship and living to be able to say, oh, I can, look, I can do this thing. I can do this thing. So we often are now asking leaders any questions we can to help them avoid this hero space, to help them just be in this, I don't know how it's going to go. I don't know how I did there. I don't know how I handled that. I worry that I did things wrong. Any of those things, which is actually vulnerable. And it's actually the way our hearts open to each other and touch, right? It's actually the way we can feel each other's humanity, instead of like trying to do this like polished, here I am I good enough, do you like me? And then you have to do the, here I am I good enough? And then we're both acting eventually, you know.
And is there, so one of the things that comes up for me in that, and as I was reading, so it's like, I think I hear what you're saying that I didn't quite get from the book, and it might be because I was reading it quickly because we were about to speak that last bit, but yeah, the particular sense of you're right in it still. You know, you hear somebody say who's still between the trapezes in some way, still like in the disorganized state before that. I know we're talking small scales probably here rather than the developmental shift, but it could be that. But you know, these little times when I don't know how this is going to turn out, because it's interesting to, I think another part of the, what is it? It's like another thing that you see a lot is, which is not quite the same as I think what the speeches that you're talking about is the kind of hero's journey story, which tells the story of how it was bad, but how in the end
that's right,
led back to me being here today, having learned this thing. And there's a way in which that can be used strangely, you know, but also there's a way in which it's only how everything works if we're learning, right? It's like, you know, when I was thinking about what are the things that I've done or that have happened in my business, for example, because that feels a bit easier than in my personal life, that like I didn't end well. One of the interesting things is that I've done quite a lot, I guess I've done quite a lot of work, and one of the things my coaching that I've received has helped me do is take the learning from them and so see how, although they didn't end well, they are useful. And for me, when I think about the things in my life that I've done that I am most embarrassed and horrified that I've done, the way that I am at peace with myself despite them is to remember that, oh, the reason that I am able to be the husband I am now is because of the mistakes I made as a boyfriend in the past. Like, you know, and repeat that across, I mean, I don't have it as fatherhood, but across work, across all these other parts of life. Yeah, I don't know what you make of that.
Yeah, I love this distinction. There are some times that people tell these stories, so we've heard a lot of them now, and there are some times that they tell them and they have not yet made sense of them. They are carrying them in a way like a wound. You know, like one of the stories that's not so uncommon is a story like my best friend and I started a startup years ago. This is not my story, but I've heard it actually a bunch of times. And it became more successful and more successful. And at some point, I needed to decide, are we going to go with what the organization needs? Because this person can't handle where we've grown to. Or am I going to go with what the friendship needs? And in the stories that I remember, they go with where the organization needs, and they like fire this best friend. And they can come to make sense of that. But often in the stories that I've heard, they just carry still such deep shame and pain about it. And one of the things that telling a story that's unresolved does is it helps people make sense of it. It helps others help you make sense of it. Yeah, you were 23 when you made this move, or yeah, but how many times have you done something afterwards that you've learned from it? To connect exactly what you said, the thing that we can learn, the way that it did change us, and to make that connection is really powerful work. And I think you're right. For our growth to happen, we have to make sense of those stories in particular ways. And so it might be that so often the stories have either this quality of old wound I haven't really connected with yet, or I'm in the middle of this thing and I am between the trapezes and I don't know I just want to let you know how much I don't know how this is going to go.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which is itself like a,
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it feels like, yes, I'm just trying to catch one. I see if I can catch one for me that's like going on right now. I think probably the closest one I have is where we're potentially days away from moving to a lovely house in the countryside, or buying that house, but we still, for various circumstances that are going to have no idea how that's going to turn out, because for bizarre reasons, there's a parallel sales process going on, and with a different buyer and a different seller, and apparently if they complete first, they get the house, and if we complete first, we get the house. And who knew this was going to happen? Not our solicitor. Didn't know about this kind of thing anyway. But it does mean that we're right in the middle of this, and it's pretty. I can feel a lot of like. It was quite hard actually. I had a nap before this call, because before that I was amped up because our solicitor's going on holiday and for 2 days in the middle of this, and it's like, no, like what if those 2 days are the thing? And so we're like right in it, and like I have no idea what will happen for us if we don't get it at this stage, because we're so close that no matter how many mindset tricks I've tried to tell on myself, I want to live there now. And I'm picturing the tree in the garden and the rooms I'll have my office in, all that kind of thing. So it's right in the middle of that.
yeah, and you're seeing yourself. You're seeing all the ways you bump into yourself in this unknown space, right?
Yeah. I'm just noticing though, it's like to try and play with that unpolished vulnerability in some ways. It's like it's a really telling that story now. Like I've kind of, in a way, I guess I'm noticing I've practiced that in different ways. Again, it's been like part of my journey. And I'm also remembering I went to an event for coaches once, and they had this check-in in these little groups that we were in. This would be a good kind of unpolished vulnerability question. Actually, really hard. It's like, what I don't want you to know about me was the check-in. It's really hard to find something that is not so personal that I cannot share it, but isn't one of these polished vulnerability things that are really tempting. And I remember it. I remember the group, and it was like they were all quite different, but they were all. But I think it did that thing, and the impact of it was swift and big. Yeah, for that group of people who I can basically, half of them I can picture now.
That's
5 years later, you know what I mean?
Right.
We were only there for it was 3 days or something, and 4 or 5 times over those 3 days we were in this group of 8 or 10. It's like they're powerful practices.
Yeah.
Jennifer, I wonder if we could go back to your story a little bit, just to kind of, before we, maybe there are other things from the books that we want to jump into, and I'm also curious to hear a little bit about kind of patterns that you're seeing in your work at the moment, because I think there's some interesting, with the viewpoints you bring about and the world we live in. So I'd like to ask about that, before we finish. But before we do that, we were talking in your story about the doctoral and postdoctoral work, and then you mentioned the move to New Zealand as a key thing, and I think that was, you were in New Zealand probably when I first came across your work, so I'm guessing you were there a little while. I wonder, what were the key things that happened as you moved gradually, without really meaning to, from supporting teachers and professors to supporting leaders with their developmental challenges? And I think somewhere in there, from what I read in the thank yous and things like that, or the gratitude souk of the latest book, that's partly when you met Carolyn Coughlin, who's your co-author, around then as well, or maybe that's not right, but some key things it sound like must have happened in those steps. And I wonder what, as you look back, what they were.
Yeah. I've also got my mind on like how polished is the story as I would tell it. What would I tell you?
Well, it's nice that we've primed us for unpolished a little bit as well, haven't we?
That would be new. Yeah, we moved to New Zealand in 2006. My husband and I and our little kids. We had a 5-year-old and a 9-year-old. and it was kind of like our adventure. I was a university professor. I was taking a sabbatical. I had 12 or 18 months to try this thing, and then I was going to go back. And then I didn't go back. We haven't been back. We haven't lived in the US again, because we lived 12 years in New Zealand and then moved to London. And then we were like 4 years in London. Moved to London for 6 months and stayed 4 years. And now have moved to France. I live in a big house in the southwest of France with a bunch of friends.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that. Maybe now's the time. I actually went back and found it because I kind of remember, I'd kind of forgotten this. I remember reading a blog you wrote about. I thought it was about you having already moved, because that's what when I read there were some thank yous and things about that in the latest book as well. But when I found the blog again today, that you wrote back in, I think, I can't remember if it's 2020 or 2021. And it wasn't. It was a dream. It was like it was a kind of an unpolished vulnerability. Although it's hard to do that when you're a great writer like you are, and you can't help but pull out lessons for people in it. But I remembered it as being reality already so much that I was a bit disappointed to find out the picture on that article is not a picture of the big house in France that you lived in, because I kind of for some reason imagined I'd remembered that it was. So yeah, maybe
I have to look at the picture.
Yeah, maybe
I have to look at the picture.
But tell us maybe a little about that process, about that dream to reality process. And we'll come back to the other thing in a minute, because we can do whatever we like on this conversation. Well, if you're up for this, because it's like, so people can go and read the article. We'll try and find a link to it again. I'm sure I'll have it. There's this really nice thing that Jennifer says at the start of it, which is, have you ever had a conversation over a glass of wine or a cup of coffee with friends where you say you'll go and do, I think you name this one, right? We'll go and live couldn't it be amazing if we go and live in a big house, all of us, in this place or that place or this other amazing place? And people will recognize that. But that also, I always think about all the bands I've started. I've never been in a band, but I've started a lot of them. All the bars people will open, these things, they just come out and emerge between a group of people sometimes. And like my bands, they never happened, or maybe they happened like for one rehearsal and then it's all over. And yet you are living in a big house in the south of France with friends, colleagues, children, all these kinds of things, I think. So yeah, what's that like, and how did it come about?
Totally wacky. It's wacky. So it was in COVID. My friend Wendy, I also have a weird life, because I started this firm with a couple of friends, Carolyn and Keith, with whom I wrote Simple Habits, and Jim, and I started this firm together. Whatever, we don't really even know, like, let's say 15 years ago ish. And now we are about 90 people who work together. And still the thread of friendship is one of the defining colors of our firm, right? Like, we deeply value friendship. We're founded of friendship. We're made of friendship. And so this idea of making communities where relationships are central, and like, we have a commitment to always putting the relationship above money, for example. This has been really important to me. So I happen to work with a ton of people I love, right? This is one of the things you need to know. And so one of those people that I love, a woman named Wendy Bittner, she's on my leadership team. I adore her. She was having a hard COVID experience, as many of us were. And she was living by herself in California, and she was not thriving in this world. And I said, come to London. So she got on a plane all masked, and she stayed in London for a month or 6 weeks, something like that, living in my house. And we could do nothing, right? Everything was closed, and we couldn't go anywhere. She loves good food. She couldn't go to a restaurant. There's nothing to be done. And she was mostly working still on West Coast US time. So she had like these crazy hours. But we would run into each other in the hall, and, we'd see each other when she was off the phone or when I was off the phone. We'd have a glass of wine together. And she was like, I love this. I was like, yeah, I also love this. And she was like, we should like buy a house together. I was like, let's do that. And so we got, I talked to my husband, Michael, about it. And like, what do you think about this idea? He's like, I'm used to you having ideas like this, whatever. My friend Zafar Achi gets involved also in this set of people. And suddenly the idea, because there are more of us now, I think with any one of us, the idea would have been like one of your bands. But each of us brought like a different part of reality to this idea. And somehow we had enough parts of reality so the idea started to actually move. And before we knew it, we're like, yes, let's really see what happens. So I wrote a letter and invited everybody in the firm to get in on this idea with us. Like, anybody who wants to come, just come. We'll buy a house together. Come on. And then, like, with some trepidation, I waited to see who was going to come. And I totally never would have guessed the people who said yes. I never. If you had said, choose the 5 people most likely to say yes, I would have chosen 5 completely different people. And eventually there were 10 of us. And then, because Zafar is who Zafar is, Zafar's just like, it's like a bulldozer. And suddenly there's a house and we're looking at it. And then we own it. We own it. And then suddenly we're living in it. And so there was like this series of things. One of the ways I've noticed my life unfolding is one small thing leads to the next small thing, which leads to the next small thing. And then, like, we have arrived at a thing that, starting from this point, this is like ridiculous. You would never, like, our move to New Zealand was like that. Like, suddenly we were living in New Zealand and people are like, how did this happen? And the step from living in Washington, D.C. to living in New Zealand was completely ridiculous, completely like an incoherent idea, like a ludicrous idea. And like, I would tell stories about it as if it were reasonable. It was completely unreasonable. And the step from living, in Pimlico in London to living in the French countryside is like completely unreasonable. Living with all these people, and all these people like just putting like $100,000 into a pot, and saying, oh, let's see if we can buy a castle. Like, if our pot of $100,000 each gets big enough, we can buy a castle. It's ludicrous, absolutely insane. But there it is, and there we are, and there's a place that insanity is. There's a way I feel a little bit like uncomfortable about it, like, it's not very well planned. We didn't do a lot of research, right? Like, these things that are like responsible grown-up things to do, we really didn't do. And we get into situations all the time where we're like, was anybody thinking about that? Did we like wander in and like nobody thought about that? That's a problem. And on the other hand, there's a way that it's like, that is actually the coolest part of life, right? When you find yourself in a clearing in the woods and you make a house there, or you find yourself on an airplane next to somebody and you make a friendship there, or whatever it is, that we couldn't have planned and predicted, and we don't know what's going to happen next. I have no idea. Literally, I have no idea what's going to happen with this house. We've lived there about a year. It's amazing. We're about to do a big renovation project. This is not necessary. It's just good. And it's going to cost a fortune. And sometimes we look like a sitcom of people that from your seat you'd be like, don't do this thing, like you're crazy, don't do this thing. And sometimes it's like, yeah, but that's what makes sitcoms fun.
Yeah. Well, and it's like it seems like it's perfect that it's that way, given you and your colleagues and what you do, because I can kind of hear it in the we shouldn't do it like this, right? Normal people, good people don't do this kind of stuff. But it sounds like that's also how it's pretty much how you described how your career worked. And um, yeah, it's like, I don't know, it feels like there's a real integrity to it because it's kind of how you, it feels like, I'm not sure I can quite map it, but I could have a go, but it feels like it is the work, right, that you do. It's like we can't predict it. We can just do some things and try and do them well. And we don't know where we'll end up except the grave at the end. But while we're here, we might as well do some things. And I don't, it's like I'm not going to regret not being in a band, but some people will regret. Maybe I will. I don't know. I feel like I completed my music heroes journey, but like there will be people where it's like all those little bits of friction that can happen. The people will have regrets about that. What would it be like if we all lived in a place together? And yeah, thinking about the house that we're moving to, it's like the exact timing of us doing this, it required, and this place required a crazy sequence of events that we could have never predicted. And maybe it won't end in that house, right? And we'll be in another, next time we speak in 2 years or whatever, there'll be another house that we're in somewhere else, who knows, in a different part of the country, and the story will still be the same. But yeah, it's a beautiful story about ending up there, and I love the sitcom element of it and imagining this complexity fit castle in France with a bunch of people doing a renovation. That does sound like a great sitcom for coaches, at least.
And there are all these things about like the difference between my dream and the reality. It's not a castle. We bought was a resort, a very small 3-star resort. And it means that there's like one place, one big building that's kind of one house. And then there are little dwellings. And I really didn't want that. I really didn't want these separate dwellings. I was like, it's going to feel less like we live together, more like we're neighbors. I don't like that. And other people were like, I need that. I was like, I don't like that you need that. They're like, I don't care. And we ended up buying this house that has these places. And I see, oh yeah, like a lot of people need that. They need to have their their own space that's really separate, like in this polarity of together and separate. Other people need more separate than I do. And that's super legitimate. And if we had it my way, there were all these like early battles of like, how are we going to live together? And I lost almost all of them. I was like, yes, this is my vision. And they were like, yes, I don't like it. And I was like, oh, and we've created a really happy home. And we have dinner together every night,
Wow.
basically every night. And sometimes there are 3 of us, and sometimes there are 20 of us. And if it had been the way I wanted it, it wouldn't have worked so well. And if I had tried to push my agenda, it wouldn't have worked so well. But if I hadn't pushed at all, it wouldn't have happened at all. And so it's this this question I never know the answer to about when do I push and when do I release. I never know the answer to that. It's always up in the air. And the answer is you have to do both.
Yeah, there's a thing that I can't remember how I just said it to a client one day, and then I realized, and now I say it to clients quite a lot, which is that I often create a vision with them for our work in 12 months, what will life be like? What do you want? How do you want, what's success for us? And what I started saying to them after I think I just randomly said it one day is, I've noticed that the specifics of that vision are often wrong, but usually the spirit of it is right. And like you said, if there was no vision, they wouldn't get the spirit of it necessarily in 12 months, the value in that. And it's in your book, so I really liked it. You said it just really clearly, this what I think it's the same tension, or a very similar one, which is holding both, I want to be more than I am today, and holding, I am enough as I am. And I think that's I think it's like a paradox, an important human paradox.
Yeah, particularly in our profession, right? Because there's a thing about the coaching profession that's always like, oh, tomorrow, like we're gonna be better. We gotta be self-improving all the time. We gotta stay ahead. We gotta be going. We gotta like be reading more and doing more workshops and have more certifications and like and that's just exhausting. It's exhausting. You can never harvest anything if you're like constantly ripping up the field and replanting, right? And it's not wrong if we stop learning and we stop growing, and then we're trying to help other people learn and grow, like that's awful. And so yeah, the answer to almost all either or questions is both.
Yeah, it's another one of those things that's a bit annoying, isn't it? It's a bit like when you see
So
you can't really see, it's like,
annoying.
oh, but come on. Wouldn't it be nice if there was a right answer? I could just know, if I did 2 hours of reading a week, that would be the right amount. Wouldn't that be really great?
It's right. That's right.
Yeah. Jennifer, let's like for what is it, for completionist listeners, let's like, I'm gonna ask that question I asked before and then interrupted you to ask about France. And I guess now we've got more language for it. We've got this like, you've ended up where you are. And maybe we're talking more about work now, because we've just done a little bit of this about home or location. You've ended up where you are. You could never have predicted that. It's probably nothing like how you imagined, especially when you were moving to New Zealand to be a professor, without polishing it too much. And great catch to mention that before. Like, what are just in this moment, what stands out about that transition, perhaps particularly to maybe the company and it becoming a thing in your life?
What stands out most? What stands out most is that we never, ever, ever imagined we would be so big, ever. When there were 3 of us, we had a Post-it on the wall about how we were going to get to world domination and how we were going to change the world. And we were kidding, right? Like it was a joke. And we kept it up to kind of remind ourselves we were 3 random people. And now we coach really senior leaders at many of the largest organizations in the world. You know, we have a really crazy amount of impact on the lives of, you know, thousands, tens of thousands of people, 100,000 people. You know, like it's a lot. It's a lot. I think what stands out is our friendship really has been the grounding force of our growth. And how to be fierce friends with each other, right? To be always there on behalf of our unfolding, and to really hold each other to the values. It's like the France thing. Cultivating Leadership has gotten really big, and we've just recently changed our ownership structure so that the 4 of us who created it and own it, we decided early on not to be a partnership because we were serving too many partnerships and we couldn't figure out how that how that really went well in a way. I'm sure it does go well many times, but um, so we didn't ever grow from those four, and so we four have owned all the little companies that spread up all over the world under the Cultivating Leadership umbrella, and we've just given it away. We just signed up the papers to give it away. We four gave it away basically to itself. We started a foundation. We gave the company to the foundation. The foundation owns the company. Folks from inside the company, us and others, lead the foundation and then distribute any profits for basically justice and sustainability causes. And I would never have been able to do this by myself, right? And I'm not sure that the forces of either the forces that keep me small, like my own insecurities, my own fear about putting what I believe in the world out into the world, like all the things that make me small, or all the things that make me self-protective, like you know, my desire to have a bigger return, or like to squeeze more out of the firm, or whatever it was, like all these shadowy bits of me, which are absolutely there, were met by the light in my partners, right? And when they were in their shadowy bits, then my light could shine, and we could together hold each other to innovate and to be true to what mattered most to us, even when we were afraid. And I think that's enabled us to do something that's bigger than any of us could ever have done. And that none of us ever saw coming, ever saw coming. And yeah, I think this is the thing to say. When we are building companies that are based in friendship, and love and commitment to one another, then, like all friendships, love and commitment, like the greatness that is in us can come out, even as the smallness that is in us can be held, can be cherished, and not allowed to run away with the show. And I think that's where we are.
And I just caught the echo of that that distinction you make in the book. Like I want to be more than I am today. The greatness can emerge, and I am enough. The smallness can be held. It's really, really beautiful. And I think that in there, in those last 2 or 3 minutes, you know, I had, you know, these questions or thoughts flash through your mind. I thought, oh, the next question can be, what are the conditions that help create this? And then you just kind of named about, I think, 3 or 4 of them, including, yeah, I think truth in the face of fear, and yeah, the fierce friendship. It's like, that's a great, like, it's a very evocative little phrase that gives us a sense of what's required, you know, because I guess those 2 things are good examples of this, and you talk about this, I think, in both books. You know, there's dangers of being caught by agreement and there's dangers of being, you know, a group of people who are quite similar to each other, and those things probably play into each other. And I imagine that particularly those 2 things that I just named, I don't think I got the truth in the face of fear one quite right, but it was something like that, and true to yourselves in the face of fear, and the fierce friendship are part of what protects against some of the pitfalls of those things. I imagine having a bunch of, like, you know, developmental psychologists and coaches is, you know, helps in some way, because there's probably a bit of self-awareness amongst the 4 of you too.
It's pretty good. And, or anyway, there's more self-awareness when we're together and we help each other become more aware.
But it is a beautiful, you know, you've talked really beautifully there about the power of a group of people, which I think is, again, for coaches is difficult, because a lot of us work solo in lots of ways, and finding the right partners at different times feels important for some people. And I think there is a strong argument that it's important if you want to maximize impact, even in ways that you couldn't have imagined, right? Where you have 90 people as part of this organization now, and yeah, the impact, like we talked about right at the start of the call, about the ripples from this coaching. And of course, you have other programs, you have programs for coaches, you have impact through places like Coaches Rising, but you know, even just the ripples of coaching someone who is a senior leader in a giant organization, even that will, as we talked about at the start, have ripples of thousands, tens of thousands, even more.
Yeah.
I wonder, with that in mind, actually, and with the partnerships in mind, one of the really important partners early in my business was a woman called Nicole Brigandy, and she and I and a friend of ours did AODC at the same time, and then I think she might have done a growth edge coaching thing. I asked her, I texted her last night, and luckily she landed in the States just in time. I was like, is there anything you want me to ask Jennifer? And she said she's really curious about what you're seeing, the patterns amongst these senior leaders in how they are dealing with uncertainty, with the chaos, the complexity of the world. And that's a big question. And I guess it might also get into the kind of the work you're actually doing with them as well. What comes up as I ask that, all those things?
The reason we wrote this new book is because people are so exhausted and so overwhelmed. Like, I've just never seen so much like people on their knees and understanding. It was like everybody got disorganized at once. Understanding that the way we have been won't hold, and yet having no clue about where to go. So I've just seen this again and again and again and again and again, and now I see the different ways people have tried to deal with that, like organizationally. Do we tighten things? Do we centralize? Do we, like, try to make it so that this thing doesn't happen again? This thing that's so overwhelming and painful. Or do we try to build in more fluidity, more flexibility, more capacity? Of course, the answer is both, right? Always
so annoying.
Always so annoying. So I see these patterns a lot, and I see this moment when we are disorganized, I think, is one of it's painful, and it's also so creative, right? Like, what could happen now? This is the thing that gives me hope in the face of darkness, of difficulty, of the storm that's rolling in the window behind me. Is this idea that we can create new forms right now, because the old ones are broken, and things are more elastic, more malleable than they are usually. And I wonder what this means for us as coaches to go into these worlds and to hold for our clients the possibility of a bigger dream than they might have been holding for themselves, to hold a bigger dream for what their lives could feel like, for what their organizations could do in the world, for how we could be together, and the imperative for us to be together with one another in a different way than we have been before. And for me, this polarity of, like, support your clients to have their visions and have a bigger vision that maybe is bigger than they would know how to hold, that polarity is also really alive for me. It's both. We have to help them reach the places they want to reach, and do what we can to do that in a context that makes their world a little bit bigger, a little bit more filled with possibilities than they could have been without us.
one of my friends, a podcast guest actually on the show, Mike Toller, he once said this great thing to me, which is like, even by just, in a way, that is one of the key roles we have as a coach, is to kind of show people that things that they believe in are possible. And we do that even just by listening to, sometimes by just listening to what they want, and by not saying that's a stupid idea, right? If you just hear them and let them say it, it's amazing. He's a psychotherapist as well, and he says, what people don't realize is by the time they've sat down opposite the psychotherapist, they're telling you they believe change is possible, they believe better is possible. So it's like all of that is in there. And then there is this really interesting, I think, piece of leadership that you're talking about, and I think it's that same. I mean, maybe everything is that same tension actually between what is it? I am enough as I am, and I want more than I am today, which is actually just stability and novelty. It's order and chaos, isn't it? So it's like a really fundamental thing. But as a coach, there is something we can do, which is we can kind of invite the client into more. And I think there's like at least in my work, there's like it is incredibly powerful to sit down with somebody who essentially has, just 5% more optimism about the situation than you. And I think for me, COVID, that same thing you just said about the last couple of years, I really felt that. I saw a guy called Jordan Hall talk about this right at the start of it. He's a kind of, I don't know what he'd call himself, a philosopher maybe, I don't know. But he said this thing about chronos and kairos, and how this is a period of kairos. These are Greek, for people who don't know, maybe, again, I may be getting this wrong, but chronos is essentially normal time, Greek word for normal time, kairos for times of chaos, but also times where a lot of things are possible. And he talked about, if you're smart and brave in those times, lots is possible. And if you've been preparing for a long time, like maybe somebody who studied developmental psychology and complexity for many years with Robert Keegan and all these other amazing people, and then has built this company, then suddenly there is real possibility in those moments for creating change. Because maybe to get specific, if you can, how do you think about or hold that balance with a client around accepting their vision or their dream as perfect as it is, and inviting them to dream more?
Yeah. I think one of the things we get to do as coaches is we get to have access to so many stories. Right? The leaders we work with, they're living their story. We can look across dozens of leaders' stories. And so a piece of why I think it's easier for me to hold hope than them, because I've seen it happen, right? I've seen these things get realized. And I've seen what happens after one of these periods of disorganization, that we can reorganize in a way that's really beautiful and that we can grow. And so I feel like I have, I hold on to that hope on behalf of our larger story, because hopelessness is not life-giving. And so then the question is, how can we help breathe more hope, breathe more possibility in? Because very often the dreams people have for themselves are very small, quarterly earnings, or get this board member on side, or whatever. And we get into the tunnel vision of the thing that we think we want, and we lose why we think we want it, why it matters. But returning to these ideas of purpose, returning to these ideas of, like, this is the one life, as far as we know, that we get for basically just a little bit more than a blink. I go into every coaching session with the belief that my clients' life seconds matter deeply, and they've sometimes lost that. And that holds us in the space of enough and becoming, because today is all we get. And to leave something bigger is all we get to touch into the future, right? And so to hold both of those things together, I think is a thing that we in our profession are privileged to be able to. It's like the mountain we get to climb again and again with our clients, and we get to know some of the paths, and we get to know some of the perils and some of the things that make the journey a little bit easier. That's a pretty beautiful mountain.
Yeah. Yeah. Feels like, amazingly for me anyway, we're coming towards the end of our time. I wanted to kind of, and that feels like a beautiful place to kind of begin to tie the conversation to an ending. For people that are coming to your work, they want to read one of your books. I've read 2 of them. I've given a third one away and own it as well. I haven't gone into the 4th. Where do you suggest they start, and how do the books relate to each other?
As you say, they get shorter.
Yeah, they're lean and punchy. It is. I mean, it does mean that's one of the reasons I give them to clients. It's like, here's 2 hours or 3 hours right. Maybe, and there's a lot in there if people want it. Yeah.
So the thing that I try to do is to be on the far side, to have books that are simple on the far side of complexity. Right. This is my goal. And in these last 2 books, this is what I've tried to do. They're actually a set. They have the same characters that go through them, and they take our biology from 2 different questions. Mind Traps is about how does our biology get in the way in complexity, and Unleash Your Complexity Genius is about how does our biology really help us out. So they're a little bit 2 sides of the same coin, those books. I start
was
there.
That the intention from the start, that they would be 2 sides of the same coin? It was. There was always going to be 2. Nice.
Yeah. No, when I wrote Mind Traps, no, this other one didn't exist as an idea. But during COVID, as I was telling people all the ways their biology was getting in the way, like everybody knew their biology was getting in the way during COVID. So it's like, I get it, Jennifer, I get it. What do I do? So this book was more in the what do I do space. How can I look at my embodied system and say, oh, that's awesome, thank you. And so I'd start there. Simple Habits was meant to be like a leadership program in a book. And I feel really proud of that book, and I think it does many, many good things, puts many ideas together. But it's a lot. And the first book, Changing on the Job, is really about how we grow. It's the story of our growth. And if you're interested in, like Bob Keegan, when people ask him, what book should I read about your theory? He says, actually read Jennifer's first book, which is like very moving for me. So if you get passionate about this question of how do we grow and change over time, Changing on the Job is a good book to read. But I'd start with one of the 2 most recent and dip in and see what you think.
Yeah, and I think you've answered one of the questions I was going to ask, really, which is in those 2 most recent ones, you don't go into in really brief detail into developmental theory. Really, it's like a little snippet in Mind Traps, I think, and a little mention here and there in the other one, and just giving the answer, right, which is that the attempt is have all of that, go through all that learning, and then get to whatever's simple on the other side, which I love. I also wanted to say, because this happened just before the call, I was just finishing the book. In both books, so yeah, for people who don't know, in the books, there's a kind of fictional story that runs alongside the practices that are in each book. And there's a funny footnote, definitely in the second one. I think there's a similar one in the first, saying, if you hate the story, skip it. And I think that's funny. I want to maybe ask you about that, you know, if you go into it. But a really unusual thing happened reading a nonfiction, which is that I actually started crying quite a lot at a moment in that story. And I kind of wanted to tell you that, because it does happen to me in stories. It's why I read the fiction that I read and with the stories that I have. But it's this moment. Can I find it? It's not going to make sense for people who haven't read it, but it's this moment where Pete's in the cafe looking around. And I think I just got this, you know, it's kind of amazing, he says, how the pieces just fell into place once I decided it was a worthy experiment. And just this sense of like, it's a beautiful part of the story, sense of what was almost lost because of, what would we say, like, not, in the language of the book, not leaning into the complexity genius, just not knowing how to deal with everything that life throws at us, which is really, really, really hard for all the reasons we've been talking about in this conversation. And there's something really beautiful in that. And I wanted to share that with you, because I don't know if anyone's told you that the story that you and Karen wrote made them cry over their salad.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, I tend to get like, Jennifer, could you write a book without the stories? I hate the stories. Could you just tell me the stuff? I hate the stories. And I like I was a teacher, but I was also a novelist. The first books I wrote were novels, never published. And so the thing I kind of write the rest of the book so that I can have a carrier for the stories. And also those stories, it first happened in Simple Habits, which also has a story that runs through it. The stories sometimes tell me when my theories are crap, or when the practices are crap. Because the characters are like, I won't do that. That's a stupid thing to do. And it's like, here's me, the theorist, saying like, this is a good idea, and the fictional characters are like, this is a stupid idea. I'm like, oh, that's actually a stupid idea. It's like, you know, and no way, it's worth like working with an audience. And so, yeah, these stories are, I learn a lot from them. And yet some people, I don't think my mother, who, as you know, is like one of my role models, and she's amazing, I don't think she's ever read any of the stories. She loves these books. She gives me tons of feedback. She's super helpful. If I said, you know, like Pete, she would not know who this person is. She would not. I don't think she's ever read these stories. She's like, Jennifer, I don't like the stories. That's okay. It's okay. I wrote it so that you don't need the stories.
Yeah.
But I think they make it a lot more fun.
Yeah, nice. Nice. Jennifer, it's been such a pleasure and such a rich conversation. You know, is there anything, before we finish, is there anything that we haven't touched on, or anything that just feels like it's important to say or share?
I think it goes back to something you were saying earlier, which is that coaches we're often in onesies and twosies. Right? We do most of our work alone. We don't get to see each other do work. Like, it really is this, for a job that's like primarily about connection. It's a very lonely thing. And I really think that we need each other in really big ways. I really think the work of coaching, the work of leading, it's just impossible to do alone. It's just impossible. And so podcasts like yours, communities you're building, communities like my Growth Edge coaching community, whatever it is, right? Like the adult development, the AODC, the Coaches Rising community, all these communities, they give me hope, because leaders need us. People need us. The supports that guided us for generations are crumbling or already fallen apart. And we are some of the most important new supports to helping people grow into the capacities they need and we need them to have. And for us to do that work well, we need each other. And so finding ways to be in community and to be pushing our ideas around so that we watch out for the real dangers in our jobs, not just the isolation, but our relationship to power. We need to work on our relationship to our own theories. We need to work, like, there's work for us to do all the time. And coaching is an unregulated business, unlike psychotherapy, psychology. And the regulation has its own pitfalls, like, I understand. I'm not asking for that. But it means we have a commitment to do that work, and to know that a piece of that work is in deep relationship with other people who are doing this work. So I'm grateful for you and what you do to offer like a little windows in to this this profession that happens behind closed doors, and for all of the expansion that happens because of those windows in. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. And yeah, I feel the same about the work that you're doing, and what you've just done there is a great little list of places that people can get some of that. You know, I've been part of too, and I've heard great things from friends who have been part of the growth edge coaching community. So yeah, people should check all those out, and think carefully about that. I think those in there, in what you just said, definitely resonates with me, both about community and about the work, the responsibilities we have, because there is no one else taking responsibility for whether we are doing
right.
the work the world needs, the ethical work, all of that kind of thing, except us, really.
Right.
So yeah, like you say, like everything in this conversation, right, that's both good and not so good. Jennifer, thanks so much.
Thank you for this conversation.